Okay, welcome to this video. So on this video, I wanted to review the blood, and we're really going to divide the chapter content in two sections. We'll start by talking a little bit about functions and characteristics of the blood before we have a look of the four different components that the blood is made of. Then in subsequent videos, we'll cover the rest of the chapter, and we do also have a lab to work through in person in a classroom later today. So when we talk about the blood, it's probably worthwhile to notice that blood transports everything that must be carried from one place in the body to another. So some of the examples would be, for example, our nutrients, our wastes, our hormones, our body heat, and so on. But even though I say that, I want to put the caveat out at this point that blood does more, and we will discuss the functions of the blood in more detail in a little bit. When we talk about how much blood do we have in the body, it's about 8% of the body weight of an individual. This adds up in an average sized individual to about 5 to 6 liters or 6 quarts, if you prefer that scale. Really what most students end up saying is that the amount of blood in the body seems quite a little. So this explains why it's so easy to bleed to death. Well, for example, go into a shock, especially if we have internal bleeding. There's not that much blood, spare blood to go around. What I wanted to do as we're getting started with this chapter's content is to look at these four main tissue types that we have seen in the past. And my question to you is that which type do you think that blood falls under? So we saw our epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissues, and nervous tissues. So this is your chance to kind of practice what you learned. What type of these tissues do you think that blood is? And if you answered that blood is connective tissue, you were right. Blood is a special type of connective tissue. It connects body parts by moving materials. In fact, interestingly, blood is the only fluid tissue in the human body. And as we talk about the functions of the blood, I think the first one is very, very common to familiar to us, the transportation role of the blood. Blood helps us to move things around the body, for example, respiratory gases, nutrients and energy, other waste products, even hormones, as we discussed in our earlier chapters. But I have two other functions for the blood that I wanted to talk about. So blood plays an important role in regulation, maintenance of homeostasis, for example, the fluid balance in the body, moving fluids from one compartment to another. That happens with great ease with the blood. In addition, blood helps us to regulate through temperature regulation. So getting rid of temperature, often we do that by carrying blood to the surfaces. And when we have to minimize temperature loss, we retain the blood at the vital organs. Another thing where we see regulatory role of the blood to play role is in our pH control in the body. pH must be kept at the constant value in the body, and blood plays an important role in this as well. When we talk about protective functions of the blood, we're really going to be talking about white blood cells as it relates to preventing pathogens. We would also be able to see that blood helps us to prevent us from bleeding out, so forming a scab when necessary, so we don't just keep bleeding. We have already spoken a lot about this. We've spoken about the fact that blood has a metallic smell or taste. As a liquid, it is a little heavier and stickier and thicker than water. Blood is not fully transparent, and we can also see changes in blood's appearance based on the oxygenation level. So if blood is high in oxygen, especially when we see that, for example, in systemic arteries, it's bright red in color, whereas when it's low in oxygen in systemic veins, for example, it is more purplish in color. We've seen this before, and we'll look back to it again later on today on this video. Other things to notice, the pH of the blood is just little on the alkaline side, so somewhere between pH 7.35 to 7.45. The pH regulation really, I think, is pretty outstanding what body is able to do. Temperature of the blood is a little warmer than the body temperature, so 37 Celsius or 104 100.4 Fahrenheit. We use blood to move temperature around the body. And as we already saw, there's about 5 to 6 liters or 6 quarts of blood in an average sized adult, and this represents about 8% of the body weight. And like I said, it's less than many people often think about. So I guess that what we should do is we should talk a little bit about why we need to learn about blood. We can get a lot of information simply by analyzing an individual's blood sample. In fact, and these numbers vary a little bit. One recent paper indicated that about 70% of clinical decision making happens based on the doctor looking at the blood work report. So as you see there on the screen, you get your normal values and then you get the reference ranges. And that leads a lot of our clinical decision work. So we want to understand a little bit about why blood is so important. In addition, another thing to notice is that we can do very simple tests with the blood, but we can do highly complex analytic tests as well. What I want us to talk about next is what we see here on this slide, what happens to a blood sample that we have taken. One of the things that we often do is that we separate these different elements of the blood into layers. So let's look at that a little bit. So there's many different tests, but this is probably the easiest one. So once we have drawn the blood sample, we put it into a centrifuge and we will separate the elements of the blood based on their weight. And the heaviest material builds up to the bottom of the tube, while the lightest material builds up to the top. So let's have a look at what those elements are that we will see once we separated blood based on the weight of elements. So the matrix of the blood is really where everything else is suspended in, and that's going to be plasma. That's more than half of the total volume of the blood. It is the lightest element of the blood, so it builds up there to the top of the test tube. Then cells and cell fragments that we see suspended in plasma are known as our formed elements. And there's really three types. There's red blood cells, so our erythrocytes, which represent about 45% of the blood volume. They're the heaviest element and builds up to the bottom of the test tube. And then we have our white blood cells, so our leukocytes, and our platelets. These build up in the middle as this buffy coat, and both of those represent less than 1% of the blood volume. So let's review each of these. And we're going to start with the blood plasma. So plasma is the matrix where everything else is suspended in. It's kind of yellow or straw colored, and its consistency is stickier than that of the water. It is, however, mainly made of water. We also see many other dissolved substances, including respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, electrolytes, nutrients, so energy and building blocks for the body parts, and waste products. But what I want to talk about is proteins. Proteins represent about 8% of the composition of the plasma. And these are mostly made by the liver. And few that I wanted to highlight are albumin. This is an important buffer and also contributes to the osmotic pressure. I wanted to mention the clotting proteins. These help us to prevent blood loss when a vessel gets injured by forming a clot or a scab. And then I wanted to mention antibodies. These help to protect the body from pathogens. Overall, if we wanted to notice some common big themes, takeaways from blood plasma, composition of the plasma, blood varies as cells exchange substances with the blood, and liver makes more proteins when these levels drop. Respiratory and urinary systems regulate the blood pH. Plasma plays a particularly important role in helping to distribute, so transport body heat as well. So let's move onwards on our survey, and what we want to talk next about is going to be our formed elements. So cells or cell fragments dissolved in blood plasma. And first one that we're going to talk about is our red blood cells, so erythrocytes. Red blood cells, also known as RBCs in my shorthand notes, these are erythrocytes. There are about 5 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. And the main role of the red blood cells is really to carry oxygen. And how do how to do this as efficiently as possible is the question that's going to lead us to the answers of the next things that I want to talk about. So red blood cells are anucleate. This means that they have no nucleus. And sometimes my students ask that, how is this possible? Because didn't we just conclude that all cells have a nucleus? Well, as red blood cells mature during the process of erythropoiesis, so making red blood cells, they lose their nucleus. The explanation for that, and especially why we don't see cell organelles in red blood cells, is that we do not want to consume the oxygen that we're supposed to be carrying with red blood cells. So just like any other cells, basically every cell consumes resources themselves, and by not having these cell organelles, we're not using these resources. So I often provide my students a comparison of comparing red blood cells as to a large gas trucks that are driving on the roads. If it gets too big, it's going to use more of that resource that it's supposed to be transporting. So it really makes sense that red blood cells do not have these structures that would use the oxygen that it's supposed to be carrying. Other thing to notice about red blood cells is their shape. They're described as having this biconcave shape. So it's this disc that bends in, so concaves on both sides in the middle. And another way, let's see if I can do this, how my students like to describe is that they're like these balloons that someone is pushing from both sides. So they get this biconcave shape. And its shape is actually ideal to the function of the red blood cell. So let's unbundle that a little bit. So the function of the red blood cells was to carry the maximum amount of oxygen, and most of the red blood cells' dry weight is hemoglobin. And there are hemoglobin subunits that we'll see in red blood cells, and each hemoglobin molecule can bind to one oxygen molecule. And again, if we look at the shape of this arrangement that we see here of hemoglobins, we see the depression in the middle here as well. So that really explains the shape of the red blood cells. I do want to mention that in each red blood cell, there are about 250 million hemoglobin molecules, and normal blood contains somewhere between 12 to 18 grams of hemoglobin per 100 milliliters of blood. What I want to do is kind of return back to a concept that we've seen before. Let's look at the red blood cells with and without oxygen. We saw that when red blood cell has been loaded with oxygen, it appears bright red in color because the oxygen is now bound to hemoglobin. And when red blood cell does not have a lot of oxygen, it is kind of more of this bluish or purplish in color. So oxygen has been now given to the tissues from the hemoglobins. So we constantly make new red blood cells, mainly at the bone marrow, and we constantly remove old red blood cells, especially at the spleen and liver. So in order for us to remain in a state of homeostasis, the rates must be equal. So we make as many as we're losing of the red blood cells. And one of the imbalances in this that I wanted to discuss about is anemia. Here we see a lack of oxygen in tissues due to too little oxygen being carried by the blood. And some of the signs and symptoms that relate to that include that the patient is tired, cold, pale. Causes for this could be that we have too little red blood cells. And this can be often fixed automatically in the body with the hormones, for example, with erythropoietin. Or we can see that the hemoglobin in red blood cells is dysfunctional. And one example of anemias that I wanted to talk about is sickle cell anemia. So let's have a look at that. And what we see here is a normal red blood cell. It's this nice rounded biconcave disc in shape. And these are able to carry oxygen just fine. But when we have sickled red blood cells, sickle cell anemia is due to a single base error in the DNA, which causes wrong amino acid then to be placed into this amino acid chain. And as a result, the protein folds incorrectly. Now the red blood cell is rather than a biconcave disc, kind of this crescent moon shaped. And its shape dictates that it's not able to carry as much oxygen as this normal biconcave disc appearing red blood cell. We also see that these sickled red blood cells are particularly prone to get caught in the smallest of blood vessels, forming clusters of sickled red blood cells. We end up seeing that sickle cell anemia is particularly common in sub-Saharan Africa. So the natural question to ask is then what else is common there? Well, we end up seeing that malaria parasite is very common in these same similar parts. And as part of the life cycle of malaria parasite, this parasite has to enter into the red blood cell where it multiplies and then spreads onwards. So the sickled shape of the sickled red blood cells prevents this from happening. So sickle cell disease basically gives you a protective function against malaria. And this is most likely why it has been preserved amongst the people with sub-Saharan ancestry. So it has given kind of an evolutionary benefit, even though it's not ideal to not have the optimal amount of oxygen carried, and this clustering of the sickled red blood cells is not ideal. Well, it has prevented individuals on this area from getting malaria. Let's keep going onwards. Another disorder that I wanted to talk about, or group of disorders, we can have also too many red blood cells. And this could be caused by two main reasons. The first one is a little more serious, and the second one is something that we just see. This could be caused by bone marrow cancer. We see examples of that at the top of the screen there. Or it could be caused by living at the higher altitude, where we're really compensating through low oxygen levels at the high altitude. And the effects that we see is that the blood flow slows down. This gives us more time to compensate. Also, blood becomes more viscous. Next, what I wanted to talk about is our white blood cells, so leukocytes. We find these at this Buffy code located between the red blood cells and plasma. And remember that there's also platelets in this Buffy code. So white blood cells are, in other words, are erythrocytes. These are found in very small amounts, less than 1% of the total blood volume, except when the immune system is activated, the number of white blood cells can really grow drastically. So our white blood cells are leukocytes. They play a role in body's defense responses against pathogens. They are full cells, larger than the red blood cells, and the nucleus and the type of cytoplasm that they have play an important role in identifying the types of leukocytes. As leukocytes work, they move in and out of the blood vessels with great ease, and there's about 4.5 to 10,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. As I said, we look at the cytoplasm of the white blood cells when classifying them, and there's really going to be 5 types, and they can be divided into 2 subgroups. So we can talk about granulocytes. These have granules in their cytoplasm, and these stain really well, and also their nuclei appear lobed in appearance. We also can have agranulocytes, where we see no visible granules in cytoplasm. The nuclei are spherical, oval, or kidney-shaped. So what I would like you to be able to do is to be able to classify white blood cells in order from the most common to the least common. So let's see if I can help you with that. Here I have organized the white blood cells from the most common to the least common. And notice that this is in a normal, healthy individual. The numbers can change and do change depending on what type of a disease we might have. So my students often ask me, how do I remember this? How do I remember the number of white blood cells? And the mnemonic that I would give to you is that you should never let monkeys eat bananas. So that gives us the most common ones, neutrophils, followed by lymphocytes, followed by monocytes, then eosinophils, and finally our basophils. Never let monkeys eat bananas. So let's review each of these white blood cells types a little bit. So neutrophils are the most numerous ones. There's somewhere between 3,000 to 7,000 neutrophils per cubic millimeter of blood. They represent about 40 to 70% of the white blood cells. They are granulocytes, so the cytoplasm stains pink and contains these fine granules that we see. They also have this very multi-lobed nucleus that's characteristic for them. They function as phagocytes, so cell-eating cells at the active sites of the infection. And the numbers of neutrophils can increase during infection drastically. Next, I wanted to talk about our lymphocytes. They're our second most common types. There's somewhere between 1.5 to 3,000 lymphocytes per cubic millimeter of blood. That's about 20 to 45% of the white blood cells. They have very large dark purple nucleus, no granules in cytoplasm. They're slightly larger than the red blood cells and reside in lymphatic tissues. And these play a really important role in immune responses, and we will see two types of these lymphocytes, the B cells and the T cells, and we'll discuss those when we discuss the immune system. Then monocytes. Monocytes are the third most common type of white blood cell. I would say from 100 to 700 monocytes per cubic millimeter of blood. So that's about 4 to 8% of the white blood cells. There are no granules in cytoplasm in monocytes, and they are the largest of the white blood cells. And they are characterized by this very distinctive U or kidney-shaped nucleus. They function as macrophages when they migrate into the tissues, and they're really important in fighting chronic infection. Next, the fourth most common white blood cell type, that means that there's about from 100 to 400 eosinophils per cubic millimeter of blood. So from 1 to 4% of the white blood cells are going to be eosinophils. And they are granulocytes. So the cytoplasm has these brick red granules that we see, very characteristic. The nucleus tends to stain blue-red in color, and the function of eosinophils is to kill parasitic worms and play a role in allergy attacks as well. Basophils, these are the least common ones. There's only from 20 to 50 basophils per cubic millimeter of blood. They have large histamine-containing granules that stain dark blue, and they contain heparin, so anticoagulant. So that's our review of the white blood cells. Now let's finish off our video by looking at the platelets. And remember, these are located at the same buffy coat layer with the white blood cells. And there's less than 1% of the total blood volume that are the platelets. Platelets are not full cells, but rather fragments of these multinucleate cells, and they are needed for the clotting processes. Normal platelet count is about 300,000 platelets per cubic millimeter of blood, and they have a very short lifetime, so they must be made constantly. And that brings us to the end of everything I wanted to cover in this first video with you regarding the blood. As always, I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you at the next video. Until then, bye.